shot by Lennox Lewis.
A right hand by Holyfield.
By Buster Douglas, look at this! He's knocked Mike Tyson down for the first time in his career!
But unfortunately, it'll never happen.
Front punches, and it's over!
I think it's going to be over.
Aguero in big trouble against the ropes.
I have to say there seems an element of genuine hate between these two, Ambrose.
For sure. I don't hate the man.
Just imagine if you bought a ticket. Stop it, Frank. You can stop it any time. Castillo's in trouble. Weak steps in, and the fight is over. Oh!
Welcome back to the Legendary Nights podcast, season 3, episode number 4, the tale of Rocky Graziano versus Tony Zale. A brilliant tale and a brilliant story surrounding some wonderful fights and some attractive moments throughout the course of this episode where you will really think to yourself, I never knew this, or I never knew that. And we like putting these types of stories together because these are fights that maybe don't just jump out to the audience as go-to fights or go-to moments in time. However, boxing historians, they love the Graziano-Zale fights and the stories surround it. And we're here to tell this story of Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale. An exciting episode, Johnston, that I know you thoroughly enjoyed putting together for the Legendary Night series.
Yeah, I did. And the one thing about the fight that jumps out to many people is when you sort of jump onto YouTube, you will find that fights 1 and 2 are just non-existent. You see a few highlights, and that's it. 5-10 minutes. Third fight is the one really that gets more footage. Even saying that, it's not like the full fight. So, you know, the descriptions of the fights, we're going to go into a little bit more details than we normally would because it's not as accessible as others. But they were great fights. They generally were. We've listened to audio footage of the radio commentary. We've got a couple of books where we've cross-examined and we've tried to specify how the rounds have gone and certain action within the rounds that it's just not out there. So that's why we're going to a little bit more detail on the fight. But then the ins and outs of this is terrific. It is a great trilogy and one of the greatest trilogies of all time. It's just unfortunate due to its time, we just don't have the access and the technology available to be able to sit back and watch it, because I'm telling you, once you listen to the descriptions, you're going to be like, wow, these 3 fights, or especially 2 of them, were fantastic.
So we're going to begin with Tony Zale, and we'll begin with an extract from Tad Zale and Clay Miles' book, Tony Zale, The Man of Steel. They best described Tony's amateur career and techniques he learned before turning professional, and it reads, from 1928 to 1932, Tony Zale's amateur boxing career took off like a rocket, fighting at least once per week and sometimes 2 or 3 bouts in one night. Tony began to own his skills and deliver that devastating body punch. He had learned very well how it felt to be hit in the gut and thought that if he could perfect his style, he could drive a right to the body when his opponent's jab came forward. The timing of this counterpunch was critical. Ducking under, or sidestepping and slipping that right hand into the opponent's side just below the left rib cage and hitting near the kidney area would temporarily immobilise him. Adding a left hook to the jaw would then finish the job. In 1934, Tony won the Chicago, Illinois Golden Gloves middleweight title. Zale then went on to represent Chicago at the Intercity Golden Gloves at light heavyweight, but lost to Emilio Bettina, the future world light heavyweight champion. Brother John recognised that if Tony turned pro, they all might see a glimmer of hope and step out of poverty. He recognised Tony's talent early, and along with his help, they could make it together. John, a talented amateur champion, would be at Tony's side to make sure he was not taken advantage of, and would be given a lifetime percentage of Tony's income for his efforts.
So John and Tony Zale, they entered into a 2-year agreement with a promoter and manager named Harry Shaw in 1934. Harry had been his coach in the Chicago Golden Gloves amateur team that travelled to test the New Yorkers and had been the one who had moved him up in weight class to fight Bettina. Unfortunately, he viewed Tony as just another piece of meat. one to be chopped up and split in to line his own pockets with money and not necessarily theirs. So between the summer of 1934 and February 1935, Tony was matched in some 27 fights, whether he was hurt, sick, or just worn out. Torn muscles, were overtrained and re-injured further, and John was powerless to protect his brother. They just didn't know what to do but follow the lead from their manager, Harry Shaw, who they trusted because, as he said, he knew the business, in his own words. Tony won 17 fights, lost 9, and drew 1 during this period in time. Doesn't look like a great record. It wasn't the kind of performance he or his brother had planned. Because of his inexperience and exploitive manager, Tony Zale, with John's prompting, actually retired from the ring after that. He then went on to toughen up his body and heal his torn back and shoulder muscles. And after his early retirement, Tony Zale headed back to Gary, Indiana, where he's from, and onto the steel mills. From 1935 through to mid-1937, Tony Zale requested every tough labour job on the mills that they had to offer. From shoveling slag, which is cast off molten iron ore, around the blast furnaces, and snipping cinders, scraping the walls of the blast furnace, says that it's roasting hot in there, and lifting anything that weighed 50 pounds or more.
Tony began to heal those torn muscles without further damage and strengthened his resolve. When he came back to the ring in the summer of 1937, a Chicago sports writer said that Tony looked like a new piece of steel off the line at the Gary Steel Works. It was thanks to this reporter that he became known in boxing circles as the Man of Steel from Gary, Indiana. Tony sought advice from 3 sources he trusted with his life: God, his brothers, and Henry Wilczek, a professional tailor and wrestler. However, it was through prayer that he found solace and decided to obey the 10 Commandments and trust in family and close friends. Tony's lethal combination of rights to the body and left hook to the head began to take effect on his opponent because of his newfound power from working on the mills. So much so that his opposition dried up, forcing him to spar with light heavyweights and even heavyweights. It wasn't long before those sparring sessions came to an end, as heavier partners in his region opted out. Tony and John decided that if he was to gain more experience and improve, he must begin joining the black gyms in the area. His fearsome reputation spread like wildfire, and it was throughout the Northwest and Indiana and even South Chicago. Tony was a simple, shy and reserved man, yet it wasn't long before he also became known in those gyms as the Dark Town Destroyer.
So moving on to Rocky Graziano, and Rocky was, to be blunt here, a little thieving bastard when he was a teenager, and later in life he would actually say that they only stole things beginning with an a piece of fruit, a watch, a pair of shoes, a bicycle. It wasn't long before he was actually sentenced to a Catholic reformatory for stealing and fighting. While there, he proved himself by beating up one of the head of the gangs. While there, it was also rumoured that he met a certain Mr. Frankie Carbo, one of the mafia boys, and also Jake LaMotta, who would eventually become one of his friends. Rocky was eventually released and returned to his street ways at the age of 17. He then robbed a school, was caught and sent back. He escaped from prison or this reformatory and felt like the toughest guy who ever broke out of the slammer, and was on the lam from the cops, from the FBI and the courts. Well, as it turned out, however, it wasn't the case. It was just a local truant officer that was after him. 2 years later, in 1938, he was leading the toughest gang in the New York City reformatory, also known as the Farms. Once released, he returned to the streets and he continued fighting outside the ring. His gang members credited him with knocking out 40 to 50 kids on the street that year alone. Then an old pal who had introduced him to boxing for a short time briefly before going back inside a reformatory, his name was Terry Young, and he presented him with a new opportunity for Rocco, that was his original name, not Rocky. He called him Rocky, that was his gang name. They actually called him Rocky Bob, to be more specific, and asked if he would replace a sick lad to box in the tournament. But Rocky Graziano, he initially refused. The next day, Rocky did meet Terry in front of the boys' club where he was introduced to the sick boys trainer, Cuss D'Amato.
After watching him compete in a sparring session, Cuss became intrigued with this kid, who could clearly punch but had a flawed technique. Cuss approached Rocky and told him that if he did as he taught him, he'd never get hurt. So Rocky agreed to let Cuss train him, on the condition that he kept it a secret. 3 to 4 months later, Rocky fought in the New York Metropolitan Amateur Athletic Union boxing competition at the welterweight limit, in place of the sick kid, and won. Rocky remembered, "From that day on, after I took the city title and got my name in the papers, I couldn't walk down 1st Avenue or 2nd or across 10th Street without everybody stopping me." The local gangsters got wind of this young tearaway with a punch. That was when a fellow called Lupo the Wolf offered Rocky what he thought was the best deal. He wouldn't have to train, and he would get paid $10 to $15 a fight. This was when he changed his name and began fighting under Rocky Graziano, instead of his real name, Rocco Barbella. Rocky began to develop a name for himself, demonstrating a hard right hand with no jab. But before Rocky could really get going, he was charged with violating his probation and arrested for a crime he said he didn't commit. Rocky was sent back to the New York Reformatory for another stretch inside.
Well, I think you're getting the gist here. Completely cast of characters here, aren't they? Completely different. So we're going to jump back to Tony. While dispatching many opponents since he's come back from retirement, Tony Zale met 2 of the best fight managers and promoters around the Midwest, and that's Art Winch and Sam Pien. You may recall their names when you actually listen to the Barney Ross episode, as they actually guided him to 3 world titles. Now, after impressing them in a sparring session against a genuine contender, Art and Sam signed Tony on a 5-year contract on the 15th of June, 1938 for $200,000 and a 50-50 split and covering all expenses. I see this guy had talent. Now, with Zale's amateur experience, which was power, speed, and a deadly combination, that lovely left hook to the body and the right over the top, Art and Sam discovered all they needed to do was teach their 24-year-old protege how to rest between fights and match him with the right opponent that were a little better, or if not equal. By late December of 1939, and under his new management, Tony Zale had a record of 38 wins, 14 defeats, and 2 draws. With 5, though, consecutive knockouts. He was getting ready to spar at Trafton's gym when the National Boxing Association, as in the NBA, middleweight champion Al Hostak and his promoter Nate Drucksmann and his manager Eddie Marino, all they arrived for a tune-up bout with anyone that looked vulnerable. They watched on as Tony Zale was getting hit more than normal, and Hostak liked his style and his punch resistance, so he told his manager that Tony Zale was a perfect opponent for a 10-round, non-title fight, seeing him as nothing more than a tune-up fight. But on January 29, 1940, Tony Zale did meet Al Hostak, the NBA middleweight champion, at a packed Chicago stadium.
Zale was caught in the first round with a short right to the jaw in a flash knockdown. Hostak broke his left hand in the 5th, an injury that allowed Zale to take the last 5 rounds, according to the United Press. The fight went the full 10-round distance, and Tony was named the winner by a unanimous decision. Al Hostak felt he'd been robbed in Chicago and wanted a rematch in his hometown of Seattle. Tony Zale, on the other hand, was proud of what he'd accomplished beating the NBA middleweight champion. Feeling confident of repeating the feat again, after a few adjustments, his plan was to get enough money so that he could take care of his mother, and he said, maybe even hire a cook. Maybe she'd like that. The immediate rematch with Hostak was delayed because of his broken hand, so Zale kept active, knocking out 2 opponents back-to-back in February and March. Sam Pien attempted to secure a non-title match for Zale against the other recognised middleweight champion, holder of the New York State Athletic Commission title, Serafino Garcia, in June. But Garcia already had a fight in May. His promoter, Mike Jacobs, was then eyeing up a fight with the light heavyweight champion, Billy Conn, after his fight with Ken Overlin, a fight that would go on to lose by decision. Zale knocked out Baby Kid Chocolate in the 4th round of their scheduled 10-round contest in Youngstown, Ohio on June the 12th, 1940. Then 10 days later, Sampian announced that after a month of negotiations, he had signed an agreement for Tony Zale to fight Al Hostak in Seattle's outdoor stadium on July the 19th, 1940, in a 15-round match for the NBA middleweight championship of the world.
Now, the contract actually included a clause that should Zale win the fight, he would be required to grant Hostak a return bout within 60 days. Whether that rubber match would be in Seattle or Chicago would be Zale's decision, obviously, if he won the fight. Now, both sides, they were confident of victory. Sampian actually told the Seattle News, "You can discount all that chatter about Hostak breaking his hand on Zale and losing the fight back in Chicago as the result. Zale had him licked long before he hurt his left juke. When Tony got up off the floor in the first round, he broke Hostak's heart. He knew then and there that he didn't have any palooka in front of him. Tony got up and almost chased Hostak out of the ring. We hope his hand is good and strong, as they report, so when Zale gets through giving him a walloping, there won't be any post-mortem crying about tough breaks and bad hands." Both fighters gave their final statements before the fight. Tony Zale said, "I'm looking for a tough fight, but I beat him last time and I think I can do it again. I'm sure I'm going to make the most of my chance." Al Hostak said, "I'm in shape and ready. I've been waiting for a chance to reverse this decision of the last fight and I think I can win." Now, in front of a disappointing crowd of less than 10,000 fans, Tony Zale squashed the idea that the first victory was merely a fluke. Zale opened a cut over Hostak's left and closed the other. Both were badly puffed as the fight wore on. Hostak was then on the floor in the 12th and again in the 13th.
The Seattle Daily Times described the finish of the fight, and it reads, "There was a minute and 20 seconds gone in the 13th when referee Benny Leonard stopped the fight with Marino climbing in from the corner in token of surrender." Leonard, by the way, did a poor job for a referee brought across the country for a fight. He gave Zale every break and let fouls go along with no desire to correct them. Hostak butted and Zale butted back, but the worst foul of them all came when Zale hit low in the 11th. That hurt Hostak and took the last of the fight out of the softening champion. Years later, Tony said, "Al had the heart of a champion, but I was at full strength for that second fight, and he knew that he couldn't knock me out unless he brought a blackjack into the ring." In that second fight, though, I began to know what a truly great fighter Al Hostak really was. No matter what I hit him with, he couldn't be put away. Tony then went on to say, "Some guys can never say die no matter how bad things are going against them, and Al Hostak was more like that than anyone I'd ever met." The Seattle Daily Times also reported what happened after Zale captured the title. Some discriminating souvenir hunter made off with Tony Zale's shoes last night while the Chicago Swatter was winning the middleweight title from Al Hostak in Civic Stadium. The dressing room marauder also got Sampian's hat and Art Winch's necktie. So, the new champion had to go home after the fight, still wearing the shoes that carried him to victory in the ring.
Disappointed he got robbed, but loved that story. Tony Zale, he returned to Gary, Indiana, $3,000 richer as well, where many of his fans paraded through the business section of the city to celebrate that victory, the new NBA middleweight champion. The police were actually called out to quiet the blowing of horns and whistles in appreciations of their local hero. The following month, Zale fought in an overweight fight against Billy Sues in Chicago, but actually lost by unanimous decision. The fact that he was over the middleweight limit meant that Zale kept his title, and they never ever fought again. Remarkably, as a side note here, young Billy Sues, who trained under Ray Arcel, great trainer, had defeated both middleweight champions within a 1 month period, but failed to capture either of their titles because the contests were overweight bouts. How disappointing was that? In September of 1940, the Selective Training and Service Act was passed by the United States Congress and signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to enable the country to quickly build its military forces if needed. The act required that all men between the ages of 21 and 35 registered with the local draft boards. Well, that October, Tony Zale, along with several other notable boxers such as Joe Louis and Max and Buddy Bear, were registered for service. We're going to jump back to Rocky, and when Rocky was actually released from the New York City infirmary, he went back to fight him for Lupo the Wolf. Then one day, another guy named Eddie Coco arranged to have one of his men pick up Rocky for a fight instead of Lupo. Rocky was told that he was fighting for him now. That lasted until the mother of a 16-year-old girlfriend accused him of statutory rape, and he found himself back in a reformatory shortly after New Year's Day in 1941. Now, while in the reformatory, he was actually accused of instigating a riot and transferred to Rikers Island to serve out the rest of his time.
Tony Zale outpointed the tough Greek Steve Mamakos in an untitled fight in January of 1941. And due to his good showing, Chicago promoter Billy Rand made the rematch on February the 21st. And this would be Zale's first defence. He promised to knock out Mamakos within 8 rounds in a title contest. He said Steve was one of the most rugged opponents I ever faced, but he is only human, and constant pounding on his shin will wear him down. I am confident I can knock him out inside of 8 rounds. A crowd of 14,306, the largest to see a fight in Chicago in 3 years, turned out and produced a gate of $37,450 to see Tony face Mamakos. Zale came out strong in the first 4 rounds, but suffered a terrific beating in the 5th when he was knocked to the canvas and he was up before the count, but staggered around the ring while under a barrage of blows. Luckily, he was saved by the bell. Still groggy in the 6th, he managed to survive, although the Greek held the edge as the pair entered the 13th round. Zale landed a straight right hand that shook Mamakos to his boots and followed it up with a left to the body and a right to the face that sent him crashing to the canvas. Mamakos was still on the deck at the referee's count of 6 when the bell rang to end the round and save him from being counted out. Tony Zale, well, he smelled blood and he raced across the ring at the beginning of the 14th and landed a hard left and then a big right that dropped his opponent for a count that he couldn't beat.
Mamakos done well, to be fair, didn't he? Yeah, give him a challenge, but great finish from Zale. And on a roasting hot day in May in front of 15,000 at the Chicago Stadium outdoor arena, Tony Zale made his second defence of the NBA World Middleweight title against Al Hostock in their rubber match. Now, Hostock started fast, looking for the early knockout. He landed a left and staggered Zale with a right hand, causing the tips of the champion's gloves to touch the floor to stay on his feet, which was counted as a no count knockdown. Zale returned the favour in the second round, knocking Hostock down 6 times in all with devastating body punches, again working that body. It was a big night for Tony, who turned 27 years old at the stroke of midnight. In the dressing room after the fight, the first thing he told a reporter was, "Now bring on Billy Sues." On August 16, at the Juneau Park in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Tony Zale faced Billy Pryor in front of an estimated, now listen to this, an estimated 135,000 fans who turned out to see the outdoor free show. Thousands of delegates to the National Convention of the Fraternal Order of Eagles in session here were among those in attendance at the affair, arranged for the benefit by the Pabst Brewing Company in Milwaukee Brewery. So it was like a fundraising thing, but 130,000, incredible. According to the August 17 New York Times, the attendance was believed to be the largest in boxing history. The previous largest crowd was 120,000 who attended the 1926 Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney first fight. Zale had too much ability for Pryor. It was just a one-sided beat. He stopped him in 9 when referee, ironically, Jack Dempsey finally counted out Pryor. On August 28, it was announced that Tony Zale had signed to fight Georgie Abrams at Madison Square Garden on September the 12th in a 10-round non-title fight. But Tony Zale suffered from a skin condition and ended up spending 16 days in hospital, resulting in the fight having to be rescheduled.
Well, once Zale had fully recovered, the date was changed for November the 28th, 1941, in a 15-round title fight. However, it wouldn't just be for his NBA middleweight title, it would also be for the NYSAC belt because the new champion, Billy Sues, formally vacated his title due to not being able to make the weight limit anymore. Georgie Abrams was declared the worthy contender because he had remarkably beaten Billy Sues 3 times. As this was a unification fight, the Ring Magazine middleweight title was also on the line. Mickey Walker was the last single recognised middleweight champion 10 years prior, but the titles got fragmented into 2 separate versions, the NBA and the NYSAC. Tony Zale had the opportunity to etch his name into boxing history with victory, and he wasn't going to let it slip against a lighter puncher in Abrams. A crowd of just over 10,000 showed up in Madison Square Garden to witness history. It was a bad start for Zale, who was caught off balance with a right to the chin, which actually sent him crashing to the mat in the first round. He took the referee's count of 9, weathered the storm, and recovered without too much concern. The United Press wrote, Zale treated the fans to one of the finest exhibitions of right-hand punching to the body and chin that any middleweight ever turned in, as he provided the division with its first universally recognised ruler since Mickey Walker relinquished the title in 1931. Zale took a 15-round unanimous decision over Georgie Abrams, and Abraham said after the fight, Zale is one of the toughest body punchers I ever fought, and if I hadn't been in the best shape of my life, he might have splattered me all over the ring.
Truly devastating body punching there from Tony Zale, and he was actually surprised that he hadn't been able to floor Abrams, and he said that those body punches were the same that finished Al Hostak and plenty of other guys. Credit to him. Mickey Walker, as we've mentioned, the last undisputed middleweight champion, attended the fight and said this of Tony afterwards. He said, he reminds me of Ace Hudkins. He's rugged, tireless, and a fine body puncher with very little boxing finesse. So now, whilst Zale was making history to become the legitimate middleweight champion of the world, Rocky Graziano was miles away. He was being released from Rikers Island and then being inducted into the army, where he was sent to Fort Dix in New Jersey. Rocky and the army just didn't mix. They were like chalk and cheese because he was just too bone idle. He was stubborn and he just wouldn't follow instructions. Whether other soldiers would do as they're told and complete their duties, Rocky, he would remain in bed, literally just turn over. A corporal actually got fed up with his attitude and tried to give him a dressing down, but it never worked. In fact, it pissed Rocky off. So what did he do? He knocked him down, roughed him up before heading out for town. When he returned to his tent, he was picked up by the military police and taken to the captain's office. The captain told him sternly, I see from the way you talk, you're like all the rest of those Jews and Italians from New York City. We've got to teach you a lesson and knock some of that New York out of you. There's no place in this man's army for a wise guy. Understand? Well, Rocky wouldn't buckle down to the pressure, and he basically just replied, listen, you bum, you may be a captain and all that, but you don't impress me so hot. He then offered the captain outside for a fight. Outraged by his behaviour, he actually reached for the phone to call one of the military police officers. However, Rocky thought he was leaning into whacking one. So what did he do? He laid him out.
What a character already is Rocky Graziano.
Oh my God.
Well, he left the office, the barracks, and then made his way home. It wasn't long before he was caught and sent to a military prison. After release, he was ordered to return to Fort Dix, but deserted the army again and went home. Rocky decided to keep it to himself and began boxing professionally in 1942 under a new manager, a man by the name of Irving Cohen, a guy that had built up a stable of fighters with limited experience. Irving had heard about him and knew that a few others, including Chris Dundee, had tried working with him, but quickly gave up on the undisciplined youngster. Irving decided to give him a try anyway. He was extremely crude, but Irving saw something in Rocky and was determined to stick with him. Rocky was nothing like Zale, who would famously overtrain throughout his career, which often ended up with some sort of ailment that was unexpected. Rocky, on the other hand, well, he refused to train and basically just showed up to fight. From March to May 1942, Rocky fought 8 times, all in New York, winning 5 by knockout, drawing 2 and losing once by decision over 6 rounds. Now, moving back just a couple of months to early January 1942, and Tony Zale had announced his intention to join the Navy once his bout with the former light heavyweight champion Billy Conn was concluded. Two other champions, Joe Louis and Freddie Cochran, were already in uniform, and Billy Conn had already completed his Army physical examination. 6 months earlier, Conn had been knocked out in the 13th round by Joe Louis for the World Heavyweight title. By failing to beat a light heavyweight more convincingly, Louis actually came under a lot of criticism, and there were several people who claimed that the fight was evidence that he, as in Joe Louis, had begun to dip.
Yeah, so they're all sort of heading towards war, some of them, those that are not inside. And so it was a turn up for the books when Conn actually decided to make a fight with the middleweight champion of the world in Tony Zale. He outweighed him by over 10 pounds, was taller and had a longer reach. Mike Jacobs actually felt that there was a lot of interest in the fight and estimated that it would produce a gate between $70,000 and $80,000. The fight was announced to take place on February 13, 1942, and the war of words began when Billy Conn actually told the world that he would knock Zale out if he ever bumped into him on the street. While preparing for the fight in Stillman's gym in New York, Zale was in confident mood about beating Conn, and he said, "If I wasn't confident of beating Conn, I wouldn't have asked for the match." And after Conn's last two showings against heavyweight opponents, almost positive. A crowd of just over 15,000 fans, including heavyweight champion Joe Louis in his Army uniform, showed up at Madison Square Garden and produced a gate of $48,000, half, of course, of what Mr. Mike Jacobs, Uncle Mike, had predicted. What they witnessed was a drab affair where Conn, as predicted, walked away with a 12-round decision. But it was Tony Zale who actually earned the admiration from the crowd for his gutsy performance. Now, years later, when asked about the fight with Conn, Tony Zale complained that he had to force the fight. And he said that he fought like I was the big guy. I had to come into him. He didn't make the fight. That's no way for a fighter to be. It's not his style. Tony Zale then enlisted in the Navy on April 9 and was immediately sworn in as a specialist first class.
On his arrival, an officer saw the name Anthony Zaleski, Tony Zale's birth name, and noticed he listed his occupation as a professional fighter. When Tony arrived, the officer said, "So you're a fighter. Who'd you ever fight?" In response, Tony reeled off an impressive list of opponents. "But I suppose you lost to most of them," said the officer. "Say, we're getting a real fighter in here this afternoon. Tony Zale, the world's middleweight champ. How come you've never fought him?" Tony wittily replied, "That's one bum I could always lick." Now that officer must have felt like a right div when he actually found out that Zaleski was in fact Zale. Now before heading off to the Navy, Tony married 19-year-old piano teacher Adeline Rishwalski on April the 11th, 1942, before reporting for duty as a boxing instructor 2 weeks later. Neither Tony nor fellow champions Joe Louis, Gus Lesnovich or Freddie Cochran were able to defend their crowns while on wall duty, as the Army and Navy would not permit them to box. In November 1942, San Juan, Puerto Rico became Tony Zale's home for the next 2.5 years. He was named the platoon leader and helped both his platoon and the entire company reach their peak physical condition. At that point, they were all sent off to specialty school. Zale refused many challenges from fellow officers to fight during his time on duty, but one man wouldn't take no for an answer. So after making himself clear that he would pull no punches, they faced off in the ring. Zale landed one body punch on the cocky light heavyweight and rendered him on the canvas, gasping for air. No one ever challenged him again after that.
I bet they didn't. Well, while in the Navy, Tony Zale had his world title frozen, as did all the other champions, but there were another fighter who was actually making a claim to his title. That fighter was actually Jake LaMotta, who had actually defeated Sugar Ray Robinson in early 1943. Do check out our Legendary Nights episode on those fights, and that one in particular. Rocky had a brief spell as a professional boxer abruptly ended when one day, as he was weighing in for a fight, 2 military police officers showed up and arrested him for deserting, because obviously he walked out and disappeared. He was actually escorted to Fort Dix, where he received a dishonorable discharge and was sentenced to a year of hard labor in the Fort Leavenworth, Kansas prison. Now, while serving 9 months, Rocky actually made some very good friends among the officers and obviously the fellow inmates, and he actually made the prison's boxing team. He was discharged or released, it depends how you want to sort of put it, in 1943 for good behaviour, and decided to turn his life around and return to the professional boxing ring. In later years, he admitted that one of his fellow gang members actually ended up doing a long stretch in Sing Sing prison, which is not the place you want to be, and another was actually sentenced to death in the electric chair at the same miserable prison. His time in that Kansas City prison made him realise that he needed to grow up, or he'd end up on the same path of those two former gang members. A new Rocky Graziano was ready to turn his life round, and that was helped by the people that he met along the way. A woman who would marry and settle down with, which was Norma Unger, his manager, who we've mentioned earlier, and soon-to-be trainer Morris Whitey Brimstein. With their assistance, Rocky realised he could make a good living as a boxer, so lost interest in criminal activities. He was also grateful to the army for helping him grow up. So he actually tried to be reinstated, but he was turned down because of his criminal record.
Yeah, probably that. Probably because of the fact that he likes fighting with the military police as well. Maybe it had something to do with it, of course. So, in February of 1944, America was actually put on alert when a talented French middleweight serving his own country named Marcel Cerdan had made quite an impression in the Allied North African Boxing Championships and was being tipped as a genuine threat to Zale's title when the war ended. Meanwhile, Jake LaMotta continued to make a name for himself back home and claimed the duration middleweight crown. By July the 1st, 1944, Tony said that his boxing skills had deteriorated because of inactivity. The reason for this was because he refused to get in the ring and hurt any of the many young amateur fighters that he was training, and he said, "I couldn't box with those kids. I must wade in and punch. I can't hold back. If I started pulling my punches to protect the kids, I would never get over the habit. I would have lost my punch, so I simply didn't fight. The war years took its toll on me." Now, as we've mentioned, there were two names that were now making claim to Tony Zale's middleweight title. They were Jake LaMotta and Marcel Cerdan. But there was another, Rocky Graziano, who was also making quite a name for himself in the New York arena. Rocky was introduced to trainer Whitey Brimstein by Terry Young, another of his criminal friends who would suffer an unfortunate end. He actually was shot to death in the back of a club. Another lesson learned for Rocky. And it was partly thanks to Whitey that he had opened the door to a new life for him. He had not only saved Rocky from a life of crime, but he also gave him the tools and values to guide him through life. They developed a close relationship while Irving Cohen mapped out Rocky's future from fight to fight.
And the rise of Rocky is actually quite unreal. I mean, we're going to run through this now. It's an impressive way that while Tony Zale was in prison, basically, Graziano makes a real name for himself, and that's what we're going to go through now. And even with Cohen and Brimstein by his side and a change in attitude, he still hated to train, though. Speaking of Rocky, Whitey was actually quoted in the book Corner Man by Ronald K. Fried. He said, "You've got to give guys who punch with Rocky or he don't like it. So, you don't like runners. Give him a boxer in the gym and it's no good." In the beginning, he would have trouble getting Rocky in the gym, but once he started to make money, he had no trouble getting Graziano to work. Rock can be very serious about money. Now, Whitey was assisted by Al Silvani in the Stillman's gym, and he actually described Rocky's rogue technique. He would always choke you with the left hand and hit you with the right and knock your head in. An interesting technique. The moment Rocky returned to the ring, he had been fighting 6-round bouts in small arenas. He was just making his way through. He was fighting at welterweight, beating most of them up. His powerful right hand punch was a real crowd pleaser, and it forged his reputation as a fighter to watch. He won 9 and lost 1 from June to September 1943, but he was able to move onto big time quite early when Irving Cohen actually booked him to fight in Madison Square Garden. However, the results of some of those fights did not quite go to plan for Rocky Cohen and Whitey and what they expected. They thought that Steve Rigo would fall from Rocky's hard right hand cross in November 11, 1943, but Rigo managed to stay away from Rocky's wild approach and win it on points. I mean, the trick was just stay away from Rocky. The same happened 7 fights later in February 1944. As Graziano struggled to reach his target, Rigo won comfortably, and according to the New York Times, both were at Madison Square Garden. So it was just too easy. You know, he's swinging for the hills, and if you could move away from him and you had good feet like Rigo did, you're going to beat Rocky. Well, Rocky then went 14 fights unbeaten, a great run from February 24th to October 24th, 1944, winning 12, knocking out 8, drawing 2, with only one of those fights going the 10-round distance, the first time in his career.
Rocky Graziano now had a career record of 35 wins, 4 losses and 5 draws as he went in to the Harold Greene fight at Madison Square Garden in New York on November the 3rd, 1944. Greene was too slick for Rocky, and he went on to take the upset win, a 10-round bout which was won on points. Now, the International News Service, INS, reported Harold Greene moved a notch up the pugilistic ladder today by virtue of a 10-round decision over Rocky Graziano in an all-New York main event tussle at MSG last night. Greene floored Graziano twice in the early rounds and was floored in the final stanza himself. He finished virtually out on his feet, but had piled up sufficient points to earn the decision. The following month, on December 22nd, Greene and Graziano met in a rematch at the Garden in front of over 10,000 fans. Graziano fell short again and lost back-to-back defeats for the first time. The United Press wrote, Greene won the split decision by virtue of his speed and persistent rain of punches on the wild, swinging Graziano. It was a good bout, in which each boy hit the canvas once. Greene floored Graziano for the count of 4 with a right to the chin in the second round tonight. Graziano sent Greene to the deck for a 9 count in the 8th stanza with a roundhouse right that came up from the canvas. Rocky refused to allow himself to get disillusioned with the sport, even though he was frustrated to lose 2 high-profile fights at the Garden. As the year ended, Rocky was married and had a baby daughter. He took a few months off, and when he returned, Brimstein and Cohen decided that it was time for him to move up to middleweight, which would become the perfect weight class for him.
Now, his first fight at his new weight was against a real slick operator in Billy Arnold, an African-American, who was even mentioned in the same breath as a certain Sugar Ray Robinson, and he was meant to be as class as him as a middleweight. Robinson at this moment in time was welterweight. Neither Cohen nor Whitey was sure that Rocky would outpoint Arnold, and they knew he would have to win by a knockout. And as we've mentioned, you know, some of these fights you swing for the hills, and if you're good enough, like Arnold was, they're going to win the fight. So they weren't convinced. Now, Rocky actually asked Cohen, did you make the match of Arnold? He replied, why do you want to fight him? And what makes you think you can beat him? Rocky answered, because he don't run. But he punches, said Cohen. I'll punch too. Don't worry about punches. If you want to worry about runners. Anybody that can punch, you get him. Get Arnold. So Cohen made the match, but he and Whitey made Rocky promise that he would have to train properly. So for the very first time, by the sounds of things, in Rocky Graziano's career, he went away to a training camp to prepare for the contest. On March 9, 1945, at the Madison Square Garden, Arnold came out of his corner and boxed with style and finesse, and while Rocky, as usual, was wild and aggressive and swinging and missing often. By the 3rd round, Arnold, of course, as many predicted, was ahead on points. But after delivering a series of hard punches which Rocky took, he found an opening, and he stunned his opponent with that powerful overhand right that put him down. Arnold actually did recover twice, but the 3rd right hand left him laid over the ropes. And there's a great picture of him just sort of laying over the ropes, Rocky standing over him. Rocky had finally delivered the defining moment of his career and become a genuine contender. Following a 4th round knockout over Solomon Stewart, Rocky met Al Bummy Davis, on May 25th, 1945, in a greatly hyped fight by the media. Rocky knew that if he beat Bummy, believe it or not, apparently Bummy was meant to be a bit of a hard name back in the day, he would be unstoppable for a match with the middleweight champion when he comes back to fight Tony Zale.
Well, the two fought like demons for the first 3 rounds, but then in the 4th, Rocky landed his powerful right hand that dazed Bummy and left him disorientated, ending the fight. Rocky was congratulated by his corner, Whitey slapping his back and pulling a robe over his shoulders. They knew Rocky was on his way to the title fight he had been dreaming of against Tony Zale. The press ate up Rocky's story, calling him an underprivileged East Side kid who'd punched his way out of the gutter. Popular sports columnists proclaimed Rocky the new Stanley Ketchel. When he was asked if he could beat the other middleweight making a name for himself, Jake LaMotta, Rocky replied, "I could always beat him in reform school." They had actually met when teenagers when Rocky was a tearaway and serving his first stint in the reformatory. The next opponent for Rocky on his climb to the championship was the formidable Fred Reddy Cochran, the reigning welterweight champion, who, like Zale, was serving for his country. Cochran hadn't fought since 1942, a defeat in a non-title fight against Fritzy Zivic. However, he'd returned to the ring in June to prepare himself for his last title defence in February of 1946. Rocky Graziano and Cochran fought on June the 29th in what the Ring magazine called it the fight of the year. Although Red's title was not at stake, Rocky, as usual, was outboxed for the first 8 rounds, but he knocked Cochran down in the 9th. However, the bell saved him. At this point, it was a foregone conclusion, as a badly hurt Cochran was knocked down for the full count in the 10th. In a rematch 2 months later, Rocky and Red reenacted their first fight. Red Cochran couldn't block or avoid Rocky's right hand in the 10th round, and he was knocked out again, just as he had been in their first encounter.
There you go. When you can't stay away from Rocky, you can't keep him off you. He was banging trouble when he was a middleweight, and Rocky was now being called the $1 million baby. Rocky's swift rise in the rankings resulted in him being named the best new fighter of the year by the Ring magazine and received honourable mention for their annual Boxer of the Year award. The following month, Rocky got a chance to avenge his 2 defeats against Harold Greene at Madison Square Garden. Behind on points, Rocky nailed Greene flush on the chin with his murderous right in the fateful 3rd. Harold fell face forward to the canvas and rolled over flat on his back as referee Ruby Goldstein completed the count of 10. Greene jumped to his feet, yelling that Rocky had hit him illegally on the break and tore after Rocky in a neutral corner. Goldstein threw his arms around Greene and led him to his corner. There, Greene suddenly eluded Goldstein and tore across the ring to Rocky's corner. Cohen and Whitey saw him coming and threw themselves before Rocky. By this time, Sol Gold, Freddie Brown and Charles Duke in Greene's corner had followed Greene across the ring and joined in the shoving and pushing. Graziano threw his robe away and the two struggled to reach each other. But it wasn't until the police entered the ring that order was restored. Funny antics there after that fight. Now, Tony Zale was honourably, not dishonourably like Rocky, honourably discharged in late 1945. He was greeted by his wife and now 2 young daughters, Mary and Teresa. Zale had been allowed to return home only on special occasions, hence that 2nd child. In October, the NBA president, Abe Greene, announced that all champions were required to defend their titles against valid contenders once they received the proper period to recuperate. The logical contenders were Jake LaMotta, Georgie Abrams, Holman Williams, and of course, Rocky Graziano.
Zale made his ring return on January the 7th, 1946, against Bobby Giles, knocking him out in the 4th. Afterward, his co-manager Art Winch said, "He had a little trouble with his timing, but after 4 or 5 fights, he will attain his true fighting edge. He can still punch." Back to Rocky, and he had earned a unanimous decision over Sonny Horn in Madison Square Garden on January 18th, and he followed that up by blasting away the new welterweight champion, Marty Servo, in the 2nd round of a non-title fight in the same venue on March 29th. Some were now referring to Graciano as Rockabye Rocky because he was now rendering his opponents unconscious. There was a strong belief that the next time Rocky would enter the ring, it would be against Tony Zale for the middleweight championship of the world. Well-known New York promoter James Johnston was picking Rocky and he said he ought to knock out Tony Zale after witnessing Rocky's destruction of Servo. By March 31st, it was being reported that Zale had already been signed to defend his title against one of 5 challengers, with Rocky's name heading the list. All that remained to make the fight a reality for what was expected to be one of the richest middleweight championship fights in history was, of course, to obtain Rocky's signature on the contract. As that match continued to take shape, it was announced that Tony Zale would fight in Memphis, Tennessee on May the 2nd against an opponent yet to be determined. Now we move into the build-up for the first fight. So on April the 3rd, promoter Uncle Mike Jacobs confirmed that Tony Zale would, in fact, fight Rocky Graziano for the world middleweight title when he issued a statement announcing that the pair had been matched to meet in the Yankee Stadium on July 25th, 1946 for a 15-rounder.
Uncle Mike Jacobs anticipated the event would produce a gate of more than $500,000 and would be the first time that an undisputed middleweight champion had defended that title since 1927. Zale was matched with Ira Hughes and knocked him out in 2 rounds. He then knocked out Eddie Rossi out in 4 on that rearranged May 2nd date in Memphis. However, the day before that Rossi fight, it was reported that Zale's wife had filed for divorce on April the 30th. Her charges were against Tony for cruelty. She asked for $50,000 in allowance and $5,000 in monthly support for herself and their 2 young daughters. Tony had actually discovered, after returning from the army, there were serious allegations of child abuse by his wife through his brother John, and he actually brought those concerns directly to her, hence why she then requested a divorce. She was struggling, I believe, by the sounds of it, with like postnatal depression. She was really going through it while he was at war. With this hanging over the middleweight champion, he had to go into one of the hardest fights of his career against Graziano. The fight was actually finally scheduled to take place at the Yankee Stadium on July the 25th, 1946, and the event would mark the first defense of the undisputed middleweight title in almost 17 years, since, of course, Mickey Walker when he defeated Ace Hudkins in 1929. Zale arrived in New York on July the 8th to train at Pompton Lakes in New Jersey. Rocky was already training in Greenwood Lake, New Jersey. Winch said that Tony Zale had been running 4 miles every morning and sparring 6 rounds every day, and claimed that Tony felt strong and always wanted to box more at the end of every session. They planned to stay at Pompton Lakes camp right up until the morning of the fight, and then would drive down to New York for the weigh-in at the commissioner's office. Whitey Brimstein's old partner, Ray Arcel, was actually drafted in to assist Tony Zale's training camp and help repair his bad right elbow.
Well, the Saturday Evening Post described Rocky as the most sensational knockout walloper and the hottest box office attraction in the ring business below the heavyweight class. Joe Williams of the New York World Telegram predicted that the fight between Rocky and Tony would draw one of the 10 largest gates in the history of boxing. Both men were much better known for their offensive skills than their defence, and the public was anticipating an entertaining knockdown brawl. The fighters signed formal contracts on July the 17th, and it was reported that Rocky would receive 25% of the gate, while the champion would receive 35%. Tony's managers, Art Winch and Sam Payan, backed their guy, actually wagering $5,000 that Tony would defeat Rocky. Interestingly, it was Rocky who was immediately installed as the 12-5 favourite. Though just a week away from the fight, the odds in Rocky's favour had dropped and were being reported as anywhere from 9-5 or 7-5 as Zale continued to gain more support. For the first time in recent memory, the contract didn't contain a clause guaranteeing the champion a return match should the challenger win the title. Zale told the press, "All I want to know is who did Graciano ever kill? So, he's a puncher. A puncher has to go to an opponent, and if he comes to me as I expect, I'll knock him out inside of 6 rounds. I hope he does. If he doesn't come to me and tries to be cute in there, I'll go catch him, and I'll have him out of there, along about the 6. Both men were reportedly in excellent condition, and on July the 22nd, the ABC and NBC networks each announced their plans to televise the bout.
Shame they've never been able to really show it. Apparently there is footage out there, guys, but anyone's ever got footage, do let us know. We'd love to see it. Well, all the hype that surrounded the fight was stopped in its tracks when disappointing news emerged on July the 23rd. It was announced that the contest must be postponed because Tony Zale had suffered an attack of intercostal neuritis, an infection of his rib cage, which was caused by a virus, and the fight was going to have to be pushed back to September the 26th. However, because the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the date of the fight was actually pushed back an additional day to September the 27th. Tony Zale went home on July 24th to receive treatment, and 3 days later it was announced that he was suffering from low-grade pneumonia and had to be admitted to Mercy Hospital in Gary, Indiana. Zale was released from hospital on August the 10th and said he would begin training in early September, before also announcing that he and his wife, Adeline, who had actually now withdrawn from the divorce suit, were leaving for a 10-day holiday. So they patch things up. Once Tony and Adelaide actually returned from the holiday, she promised, so this is where there is more details on this, but she actually promised him that she would never hit the kids again with a carpet tack board, neither knee him in the groin again. She was a little bit unwell, let's just put it that way. So jumping between the two, so he had Rocky's wife now, Norma, who was actually plagued with anxiety for her husband's safety before the fight. Her relatives actually tried to calm her down, distract her from worrying too much, and assured her that Rocky would be fine, but their efforts had little effect, and Norma, well, almost fell victim to a panic attack. So both the wives really having a big impression on his first fight. And Tony Zale finally, he returned to New York on September the 17th to put the finishing touches to his training, which helped his odds because of his impressive performances at the Stillman's gym in New York. Although Rocky 27 was still the favourite by 7-5 and 6-5, not much change in the odds. At the weigh-in, Tony Zale 33 outweighed Rocky by 6 pounds, 160 to 154. There was only half an inch favouring Zale in the height and the reach as well. So there wasn't much between them apart from the weights.
Well, a crowd of just shy of 40,000 arrive at the Yankee Stadium on September the 27th, producing the largest gate in history for a middleweight fight, generating a total of over $300,000. It was reportedly the second largest amount ever taken in for a non-heavyweight battle. It was exceeded only by a Benny Leonard versus Lou Tendler in a lightweight bout at New York's Polo Grounds in 1923 that actually produced over $450,000 in receipts. Author of Rocky Graziano, Fist, Fame and Fortune, Jeffrey Sussman, said the fight would be the most popular since Max Schmeling and Joe Louis. He also matched the two fighters with this brilliant description. The Graciano-Zale fight would be the street fighter, the Italian delinquent, the ex-convict who fought like a junkyard dog in Graciano against the upright, all-American, clean-living good guy from the country's industrial heartland, Zale. It would be the gritty streets of the Lower East Side with its peddlers and gangs of tough young ethnics versus the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, where the muscles, bones and sinews of diligent factory workers turned out steel for autos and appliances. They were the ones who kept the US economy humming. It was America's industrial heartland versus America's immigrant slums. It was the rebel against the conformist, the young former thief against the steady and reliable military veteran, the rule breaker against the rule supporter. Well, at this point in their careers, Tony Zale was 57-16-2 and Rocky Graziano 43-6-5. As it was the 1940s, only two judges were confirmed, George Lacron and Joe Anganilo. The third judge was the referee, Ruby Goldstein. So now we're going to go into that first fight. And when the two fighters finally made it to the ring, Goldstein called them into the centre and gave his instructions on the rules and told them to touch gloves and give fans a good, clean fight. He sent them back to their respective corners, and the bell sounded for round number 1.
Ding, 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 ding. First round, Tony Zale enjoyed early success in the opening session, hooking his trademark left to the body, followed by that short right to Rocky's head. He then landed a right to the chin, but received a left in return. Rocky forced Zale to the ropes with a right to the head, but he responded and shook Rocky with a left hook that floored him for a count of 4. It was a shocking knockdown there. Rocky appeared more surprised than hurt, but when he regained his footing, Zale pounded him with a hook to the body, followed by another to the head, forcing Rocky to cover up. Following his success, Zale concentrated his attacks on the body and continued to push Rocky to the ropes, but Rocky came back with a right to the ear at close quarters and 3 more right hands to Zale's head as he shook him near the end of the round, while the crowd cheered in appreciation.
So round 2. And with Zale taking that first round, Rocky needed to establish himself in the next. He started with a right to Zale's face that produced a flow of blood from his mouth, and then followed that up with 3 more right hands to the head before Zale responded with an uppercut. Rocky managed to find the target with success and then floored Zale with 2 hard rights to the head. The referee reached a count of 3 as the bell sounded to end the round. Zale stumbled to his corner and told his handlers that his right hand hurt. "Forget it," said Winch. "Use your left as much as possible. Just go out there and punch." Zale replied in a soldier style, "Yes, sir." Nat Fleischer recalled the moment after he was floored, and he said he could scarcely get to his feet when aided by his seconds, yet he showed amazing recuperative powers. In Rocky's corner, Whitey Bimstein urged him to go for Zale's head. "Keep going for his head, and you'll finish him if you watch out for his left."
Round 3, and Nat Fleischer actually praised Tony Zale for his heart following the knockdown. When he, as in Zale, came out for the 3rd round and stood up under withering punishment as well. So he's showing true grit here. Now, Rocky, he obviously seized his opportunity, attacked Zale as instructed and staggered and hurt a retreating Zale with 2 hard rights, a hook and another right. While jabbing, Zale threw and connected with a left hand, which forced Rocky to be even more aggressive with left and rights to the head in return. Rocky landed 2 more rights to the head and staggered Zale again with a left. Midway through the round, Rocky caught Zale coming off the ropes with a combination. Zale, in trouble, still succeeded in drawing blood from Rocky's nose with a hard left as they continued trading lefts at the bell. One scribe sitting ringside noted that Rocky hit his swaying and staggering opponent with everything but the American flag in this round, but Tony still came back to stagger Rocky at the end. Zale was dazed as he made his way to the wrong corner at the round's conclusion before realising his mistake.
Now in round 4, after a tentative start where both fighters worked behind their jabs, Zale caught Rocky against the ropes and went to work with both hands to the body before landing a right to the head. Rocky threw 2 wild rights and then both men landed heavy right-handers to the body. Zale shook Rocky with a big right to the ribs, a shot that Rocky admitted later almost took his wind away. Zale pushed Rocky to the ropes and once again unleashed a barrage of punches to the body as both men bled from cuts. Zale hurt Rocky with more rights and landed an uppercut to the chin at the bell. Rocky said later down the line, "Every time I tried to rock back on my feet, he caught me with a left to the head, a left and a right to the ribs. It was too fast, too frigging fast. I was jumping back and sideways waiting for the bell." While in the corner, Rocky told his trainer he had Zale opening up and that once he opened him up a little bit more, he then would get him in the next round. "Go get him, kid," said Whitey.
Into round 5 and the 2 men picked up where they left off in the 4th, fighting in that lovely saying you like to say, Sean, a telephone booth. At one point in the round, Rocky landed 2 overhand rights high on Tony Zale's forehead and straightened him with 2 lefts. Rocky landed a hook and 2 pulverizing rights that staggered Zale, who was on now rubbery legs once again, and looked as though he was about to go down. Zale's mouth was now badly cut and Rocky landed 2 more to the head at the bell. Ray Arcel said this on the round. He said the 5th round was just a murderous round. Graziano was winning hands down. Nat Fleischer of the Ring magazine, who served as the timekeeper for the bout, said most of those in attendance gave Zale little chance after the beating he actually received in that 5th. In fact, according to Nat Fleischer, he turned to a sports writer sitting at his side and remarked, "Too bad it would be over in the next round. Zale can't stand that punishment much longer." Damon Runyon wrote, "It's no bet. He, as in Zale's legs, are gone." Everyone thought it was all over. Absolutely all over. Even Ray Arcel, along with the other handlers in Zale's corner, Izzy Klein and Joe Needwick, worked on Zale anxiously at the break. They smothered him with cold water. They applied ice to his neck, massaged his legs, and even that usual, what you see in all the films, in boxing films especially, they slapped him round the face to bring him to life.
Ray Arcel recalled, when Tony got back to the corner, I said to him, "Tony, don't let this guy take your title away from you. This is the last round. Hit this guy with your best punch. Just load one up and take a chance." With Zale looking worse for wear, referee Goldstein went over to his corner and asked, "How do you feel?" Tony replied, "I'm all right, Ruby." Goldstein looked at Payan and Winch and they nodded in agreement, so we decided to let the fight continue. So into round 6, and as the bell rang, Rocky sprang into action and landed a right to Zale's body. But Zale delivered his own right to the body and a left to the ribs. They continued to trade back and forth until finally, Zale used his signature move that had made him a world champion. He threw a right hook to the stomach and followed it with a left hook to the head, which floored Rocky Graziano. The challenger lay on the floor in a squatting position with one hand on the lower rope. As Goldstein counted, Rocky struggled to regain his bearings and reached for a higher rope. He eventually leapt to his feet immediately after the count of 10, and Goldstein had to wrestle with him to prevent him from reaching Tony Zale as he tried to convince him the fight was over.
Yep, Tony Zale had defended his middleweight title for the first time by stopping Rocky Graziano, who recalled the moment he was put down. He said, "All I heard was 8, 9, 10, and that count came awfully fast. That jolt shot through my head to my feet. The feeling went out of my feet and I went whang on the canvas like I didn't have any feet at all." Many seated ringside who thought that Graziano had been a victim of a fast count by Goldstein, well, Nat Fleischer maintained that wasn't the case. Obviously, he was the timekeeper. He said, "I had 2 watches on the fight and my timepieces showed 10 and 3/10 of a second. Rocky lost by a fraction of a second. If he'd have got up though, would he have survived? I'm not too sure." As Rocky made his way through the crowd toward his dressing room, a fan accused him of quitting. "You yellow bum, you quit," someone shouted. Rocky furiously spun around and he actually threw a punch at the fan, but the fan must have been a bit of a boxer himself, pulled his head back at the same time, managed to avoid the full impact of the blow. Nearby fans apparently laughed in response. As soon as Zale reached his dressing room, he sat down on a chair exhausted and winced as he dipped his injured hand into a bucket of ice. Zale opened his eyes and tried to say something to the press, but then shook his head and closed his eyes again. A reporter stood there looking at him. "I never saw anybody with as much guts," he said. Payan reported, I told you all along. You wouldn't believe me when I told you he would win." While Arcel was taking care of Zale, he remarked, "You know, Ray, I said many prayers and God heard me." Ray Arcel said later, Tony was a devout Catholic.
Rocky, on the other hand, was unmarked, alert, and appeared carefree as he sat on a rubbing table and puffed away on a cigarette. He told reporter John Devney, "Hell, he looked like the loser, me the winner." Over 25 years later, Rocky said this of the fight: "The first fight between me and you, I was a wise guy. I wasn't training that well, and I figured I'll knock this guy out whenever I want. I didn't train that well for that particular fight. I thought I had a right hand and I could knock anybody out. I didn't know how tough he was, and finally he gave me a couple of good shots in the stomach and I went down. See, from the first round to the 5th, the guy is banging you in the body, and finally I started weakening and I lost." Gene Tunney called Tony Zale's comeback in the fight the greatest exhibition of heart I'd ever seen. In 1955, long-time ring announcer Don Dunphy called the fight the most thrilling sports event he had ever covered. The Ring magazine named Tony Zale against Rocky Graziano as the fight of the year for 1946, and also named Zale as their Fighter of the Year. Tony Zale was also the winner of the New York Boxing Writers Association of the Edward J. Neal Memorial Trophy. A couple of days later, Winch announced Tony had suffered a chipped bone in his right thumb in either the first or second round of the fight and would have to wear a cast for at least 3 weeks. Mike Jacobs was unwilling to reveal the gate receipts, but if both fighters did receive 30% each, then they pocketed approximately $80,000 for their vicious night's work.
Zale picking up the ring and the Boxers Writers Association. I think the only other fighter to have done that at that time before him was Joe Louis. It's a great achievement from Tony Zale. What a fight by the sounds of things. I mean, Tony Zale received another impressive greeting from his home fans in Gary, Indiana. He was presented with a watch by the mayor as a token of appreciation from the city. Rocky received a cold reception when he returned to Lower East Side in New York to an old hangout, a pool room where he had his criminal friends had spent time. So he thought he'd go there to bring himself up again. He expected to be greeted like a warrior returning from battle, but it was the opposite. They assumed that when he told them before the fight he was a sure thing, they thought the fix was in. So they all put their money down on him and he lost. He lost their money. They assumed that he had sold them out, not that he genuinely thought he would win. So cross wires there, they thought he was saying, I'm going to win. You know, it's in the bag kind of thing. They were wrong. It was a legitimate fight. Black Murderers Row middleweight, Charlie Burley, was now the rightful contender for Tony Zale's title and threw a spanner in the works for a fight to fight him before the rematch. Now, the NBA president, A.J. Greene, actually suggested 3 elimination fights be staged to determine the opponent of the winner of the rematch. And he recommended that Georgie Abrams and Marcel Sedan, Charlie Burley and Jake LaMotta would face off, and then the winners would face each other, and then eventually would go on to fight the winner of that rematch, if that makes sense. However, obviously, as we know, Charlie Burley, he never met Jake LaMotta, and he never would ever get his chance for a world title glory when this is the time when he should have. On November 17, 1946, Tony Zale's 72-year-old mother, Catherine, passed away while he sat by her bedside. The following month, on December 4th, we mentioned this in our Dark Side of Boxing episode, the most influential promoter, 66-year-old Uncle Mike Jacobs, suffered a cerebral hemorrhage that paralyzed him on the right side of the body, which actually put him out of action before he eventually passed away later on in 1953. In January 1947, Rocky Graziano was under investigation by the grand jury for his failure to report an offer to fix his fight against cowboy Reuben Shank. The fight, scheduled to take place on December the 27th, was cancelled 3 days before because Rocky complained of a back ailment.
It was reported that a syndicate of New York gamblers bet as much as $135,000 on Shank, and who was also a 4-1 underdog. If that amount was correct, a win by Shank would have resulted in a payout of over $500,000 for the bettors. By January 28th, it was reported that Rocky had admitted to receiving an offer of $100,000 to take a dive against Shank, but he insisted that he thought the man was kidding. Rocky revisited his bribery charges in his 1955 biography, and he said, "As far as bribes in fighting are concerned, payola offers for throwing about come your way all the time. All I ever done, or most boxers ever done, was laugh them off. You never had any idea how serious these nuts might be with their deals. If you reported each and every one, not only would the cops laugh you out the station house, but you wouldn't have no time to train." District Attorney Hogan said that Rocky admitted that he told the man to see him again later, and there was another meeting between the two, although the bribe was never collected. Rocky always maintained his innocence, saying years later, "Somebody called me on the phone in Stillman's gym and says, 'I'll give you $50,000 to throw this fight,' and I told the guy to go and take a crap for himself. But then the DA got wind of it. They say you're supposed to report that. I says, how can I report a thing? Anyone can come over and tell you that." Rocky stuck to this story about not knowing the name of the individual who offered the bribe, but Hogan believed he was just afraid to reveal it. On February the 3rd, Tony Zale defeated Deacon Logan in Omaha by way of technical knockout in the 6th round.
So while Rocky's going through this, Zale's continuing to fight, keep himself busy, and a day later, Assistant District Attorney Alfred Scotty testified before the Boxing Commission that Rocky had told him he had used a kink in his back as an excuse to pull out of his December fight against Shank. He didn't want to take a dive against him and was afraid those guys, I mean, we know who those guys are, might have thought the deal was on and that he had double-crossed them if he went on with the fight and defeated Shank. Scotty also said that Rocky told him that the man who made the bribe offer was within the same party who had offered him the $100,000 bribe prior to his 1945 bout with Al Bummy Davis. Scotty said that he didn't believe Rocky was telling the truth about not knowing of the man who offered him the bribe. Basically, the chances of the March title fight taking place between Rocky and Tony Zale were rapidly dwindling. On February the 7th, the New York State Athletic Commission issued its decision. Chairman Eddie Egan read a statement announcing that they were revoking Rocky Graziano's boxing license and cancelled his return fight, which was due to take place on March 21st with Zale at Madison Square Garden. Egan essentially said that it was the commission's stance that they had no other issue because Rocky's own admission that he had received bribes on 3 separate occasions and failed to report them when as required by the commission's rule number 64. Egan actually said in his own words, "It was not my privilege to determine whether or not he should report these requests or suggestions to the commission. It was his duty to do so." I mean, it is ridiculous. They just obviously didn't like the man. How many fighters around this time actually being offered deals and bribes and they didn't report them? It's like his face didn't fit. Therefore, the fight was cancelled. However, Rocky was still able to fight in other states, and the NBA backed him. The New York State Athletic Commission ruled that any fighter licensed to fight in their state, including Tony Zale, might find himself banned from appearing in New York in the future.
Those threats didn't concern Zale because he was still anxious to give Rocky a rematch, and he was willing to leave the time and place up to the promoters. With the fight on hold, Zale took on Tommy Charles on March 20th in another 10-round non-title bout in Memphis, Tennessee. With all the problems surrounding Graciano's revoked license, Marcel Sedan arrived in New York and knocked out Harold Greene in 2 rounds to stake a claim to the middleweight title. Nat Fleischer attended the fight between Sedan and Greene and had nothing but praise for the Frenchman. He said, "I think he, as in Sedan, will be the next world's champion in his class. He can box and punch and he's plenty smart, and I believe he would knock out both Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale, the present champion." However, the money was in a Graziano-Zale fight, and he would have to be patient and wait his turn. In the meantime, Zale defeated Al Timmons on April 1st, 1947 by a 4th-round knockout in Kansas. Knowing that there was more money to be made for a fight with Tony Zale in New York, Rocky and Cohen made an appeal to the New York Boxing Commission on April the 11th to have Rocky's boxing license reinstated, but it was denied. The next day, Sampion said that the way things look now, Zale would probably defend his title sometime in June, preferably in Chicago. On April the 14th, Pian announced that he and Cohen had reached an agreement for a fight between Zale and Rocky in early summer in Chicago. The commission approved the match on the condition that both fighters post a $10,000 appearance bond for the fight within 30 days. It was anticipated that the bout would be staged in either Wrigley Field or Kaminsky Park sometime between June the 25th and July 15th, and it would generate a gate of at least $500,000.
So the fight promoter was Irving Schoenwald, and he said the fighters would actually split 60% of the receipts. A few days later, the management groups agreed that Tony Zale would receive 40% of the gate being champion and Rocky Graziano would earn 20%. However, Wrigley Field, that could have accommodated as many as 40,000 paying customers, was off the table because they basically couldn't convert the arena in time. They had to get all the materials together and they just didn't have it. Therefore, the Chicago Stadium which held only half the attendance, which was 21,000, would now host this rematch. Even with higher ticket prices, the gate would be at least $100,000 less. Since the fighters' managers had already agreed, they accepted the 60% of the total gate. This meant an estimated reduction in earnings of $40,000 for Tony Zale and $20,000 only for Rocky Graziano. It's not the best of paydays for them two. Still a lot of money. Zale continued to fight, and on May the 8th, he stopped Clifford Beckett in 6 rounds at the arena in Youngstown, Ohio. 2 weeks later, the Illinois Athletic Commission gave their final approval on the movement of the title fight from Wrigley Field to the Chicago Stadium. Representatives of both fighters then posted their $10,000 bonds with the commission on May 26, guaranteeing their appearance for the event. Rocky Graziano participated in a couple of tune-up fights himself, winning via technical knockouts against Eddie Finazzo in Memphis, Tennessee. On June 10, he fought Jerry Ferrello at Toledo, Ohio on June 16. Now, it's after that Ferrello stoppage that Rocky said, "I'm a guy what never brags, but I can't help admitting I never felt so good in the ring as I did last night. Watch my smoke in Chicago." Well, he arrived in Chicago on July the 1st to complete his training for the fight with Zale and proclaimed himself in great shape, while Tony Zale trained in Wisconsin, chopping wood and running.
A confident Zale said, "I am more confident that I will win this time than I was in our previous bout last September. I broke my right hand in the second round of my first fight with Rocky, and I had to use it sparingly the rest of the way. I am punching better with my right than I ever did. I'll have 2 hands to work with in there this time." In response, Rocky replied, "I'm ready now. I wish the fight was tonight. I'm not going to fight Zale any differently than I did last time. I only know one way to fight. This business about a boxer can change his style, that's baloney. I only fight one way, all my life." Co-promoters for the fight, Irvin Schoenwald and Jack Begum and Jack Hurley, announced that $385,000 in revenues had already been collected from ticket orders. They anticipated a total gate of anywhere from $425,000 to as much as $476,000 if the event was sold out. Another $30,000 had already been paid for the radio broadcast rights to the fight. On the day of the fight, both boxers weighed in under the middleweight limit. Zale, now 34, was scaling 159 to Rocky's 155.25 pounds, and who was 6 years younger at 28. At this point, their career records were Zale 66-17-2 and Rocky 45-7-5. On the night of the fight, July 16, 1947, it was roasting hot. Some even suggested it got as high as 105 degrees at ringside. Just under 19,000 fans braved the heat and produced a new record of just under the predicted total of $422,918 in paid receipts for an indoor boxing show. The figure remained a record for indoor boxing for 14 years when it was broken by the third heavyweight championship fight between Floyd Patterson and Ingemar Johansson, which produced a figure of approximately $485,000 in the Miami Beach Convention.
So into the rematch we go, round 1. And as his usual style, Rocky rushed in, swinging wildly with left and rights, trying to knock Zale's head off and looking to knock him out early. At one point, he landed 3 rights in succession to the chin, causing Tony Zale's knees to buckle and sending him back on his heels. But Zale's grit and determination kicked in. He refused to go down, fighting back with solid lefts and rights to the body and head, which staggered Rocky after, sending him reeling to the ropes. A right hand from Zale then opened a deep gash over Rocky's left eye, and a number of left hooks followed, producing a swelling around the other eye. In his autobiography, Rocky said, "This was no boxing match. It was a war, and if there wasn't a referee, one of us would be wound up dead. I still can't look at the pictures of that fight without it hurts me, and I get nightmares that I am back in the ring on the hot July night and I am looking through a red film of blood." Well, into round 2, and White managed to stop the bleeding at the break, but Rocky rushed in at the sound of the opening bell and tried to land a big left hook. Missing, He found himself on the receiving end of a succession of short rights and lefts that opened the cuts over his left eye once again. As the blood flowed, he was forced to retreat. Rocky fought back, but his punches missed the target as Zale increasingly whipped in his lefts and rights, altering his attacks to the head and body. Into round 3, and it was early in the round when Zale sent Rocky crashing to the floor with a right to the chin as the crowd roared in surprise. We'll let Rocky explain the rest of this round.
Well, the third was the worst round I ever lived through in the ring. Before I could put a glove on Zale, he belts me a right on the jaw, and the arena is spinning, and when it stops, I am sitting on the frigging canvas looking up with one good eye blinking through the blood. I jump to my feet before there is even a count, but before I can square off, he is all over me again, whamming me in the middle, trying to cut off my wind like he done in Yankee Stadium. He caught me an awful whack like a policeman's bat socked me across the belly, and he doubled me over. Then he goes quick for my head. I can't see nothing for the rest of the round, only this red blur that comes at me, fades away, and comes at me. My head is knocked to the left, to the right, like it is going to come right off my neck. I hold up my hands, but he smashes them back into my face. I lunge out at the blur, but there is only air. My arms and legs feel like they are made out of lead, and I almost topple over. When the bell rung, I ached from my head to my feet. A possible stoppage was being discussed in Rocky's corner at the end of the third, but Rocky shook his head and banged his fists together. Whitey asked referee Johnny Bayer to give Rocky one more round, and Bayer made a face and said, "If this wasn't a championship fight, I would never let him last out the third round. One more, and if he doesn't come out of it, I got to stop it. They give you the chair for murder in this state."
Into round 4, and knowing the fight was in danger of being stopped if he didn't turn the tide, Rocky charged out from his corner like a man possessed. It was in this round that the first sign of the impact of the heat began to take its toll on Tony Zale. Rather than follow up on an advantage he had gained in the third round, he appeared to be content and to box Rocky and looked tired during what wound up being the slowest round of the fight. Zale effectively let Rocky Graziano off the hook, a mistake because Rocky landed a glancing blow that left Zale throwing for thin air and caused him to sprawl forward on his hands and knees. The champion was clearly feeling the heat more than Rocky, the younger man. Round 5, and when the bell rang, Rocky, feeling he had changed the tide, bolted across the ring and shook the champion up with 3 rights to the head and a left hook to the jaw. Rocky tore after the champion with a ferocious exchange of lefts and rights that brought the crowd to its feet. Tony Zale managed to evade some of the shots to lessen their damage, but Rocky would not be denied, and he continued to rein in a succession of lefts and rights and hooks and uppercuts, throwing combinations from wildly as you can imagine, as many of the blows began to find their mark. It was in this round that Rocky Graziano said the turning point of the fight occurred. "I hit him with a right to the ribs that made him moan. The next time Zale threw a punch, he had no steam left. I knew that was it because it didn't hurt." Rocky's blows staggered Tony Zale several times during the round, and he had him bleeding from his upper lip upon the round's conclusion.
Round number 6, and 30 seconds into that round, Rocky landed a hard right to the head that caused Zale's knees to buckle, and then followed with a swinging left to the head that staggered him back. The crowd roared as Rocky went for the kill. Zale tried to fight back, but he was too weak, and Rocky walked through the punches and drove him into the corner where he would have gone down if not for the ropes. Zale somehow managed to escape the corner and awkwardly spun around the ring with Rocky on his tail, delivering a succession of blows to the head that sent him spinning into the ropes, where he laid draped over with his head down, while Rocky pounded away at his sides. It might have been better if Zale had gone down and taken a count of 9 to recuperate during the onslaught, but he was fighting on instinct. Now, covering the fight for the New York Post, Jimmy Cannon counted a total of 36 unanswered punches in a row that Rocky landed on Tony before the referee Bayer stepped in and waved it off, bringing an end to the fight in the 6th round. Many thought Rocky had fouled Zale as he continued to pound him on the back of the head as he was draped over the ropes. When referee Bayer stopped the fight, even Rocky's managers were afraid that the fight had not been called in Rocky's favour. As Zale's handlers rushed to his aid, it took a few moments for it to sink in for Rocky. At first, he struggled to get away from his own seconds as they swarmed him in celebration of his victory, as if he didn't realise the fight was over. But then it sunk in, and he strode across the ring to shake Zale's hand, pose for pictures, and stepped to the microphone for a radio interview.
Well, after answering some questions, Rocky delivered a message to his mother, the famous message back home in New York, when he bellowed down the microphone. "Hello, Mama. The bad boy done good. Somebody up there likes me." And of course, that's the title of his book. You can get that. I can't remember how much it was, but you can go and get that book if you want on Amazon. Rocky Graziano was the new middleweight champion of the world. Tony Zale and his managers complained that the referee had stopped the fight too soon. Winch shouted that Tony wasn't hurt. Ray Alcel said that Tony's been in worse fixes than that. He could have come through it. Someone questioned Bear about the timing of the stoppage, and Bear snapped in reply, "What do they want up there? Murder?" Somebody asked me if I saw the first fight in New York or if I was thinking about what happened to Jimmy Doyle in Cleveland. Doyle had died from suffering a knockdown against Sugar Ray Robinson 3 weeks earlier in the welterweight championship bout. Please check out our career profiles on Ray Robinson. "No," he said, "I wasn't just thinking about what was happening up in that ring." He then added, "I should have stopped the bout when Zale was slumped in the corner in the 6th round because his eyes had ceased to focus. But because he was the champion, I let him continue until he was completely helpless target. Absolutely no hope of recuperating." But Zale was adamant in his belief that the fight should have gone on, and he protested, "I knew what was going on. I had 50 seconds left until the bell, and I think I could have lasted it out, although my legs started to tire a bit in the 5th round." He asked Jimmy Cannon of the New York Post if he thought the fight should have been stopped when it was. "Yes," Jimmy replied. "You might have been killed." Tony responded, "I got a right to get killed for my own championship."
Many of those who witnessed the ending were convinced that Bayer had made the correct decision, including Joe Williams of the New York World Telegram, who wrote, "There was never a more real knockout than the one Graciano planted on Zale. It was technical only to the extent that it wasn't murder." In the winner's dressing room, Rocky blew kisses at the cameras and the newspaperman in a dressing room so hot that one of the photographers passed out. Rocky said, "After the 4th, I knew I had him. I told Irvin, as in Irvin Cohen, I was going to get Zale in the same round. He said he would get me, and I did." He was asked how it felt to win the title while still under suspension back in New York. He said, "Tell the people of New York, the black sheep become the champ," he replied. Tony Zale visited Rocky's dressing room to offer his congratulations, and he was assured by Rocky that he'd get a chance to win his title back. He said, "You're the guy I want to fight," he told Zale. Rocky then said, "Tony gave me a shot at the title, and I got to give him a chance at it too." Once all the heat died down, Zale admitted that the heat had got to him. Slumped on a table in his dressing room with his head down, he said, "The heat got to me in the 5th and I couldn't do any good after that." The heat that evening was so brutal that 10 spectators fainted and were treated in the first aid room before released to go home. One writer, Henry McCormick, who covered the fight from the 3rd row for the Wisconsin State Journal, said it was hotter than you know what where he was saying, and that one could imagine how much worse it was up in the ring directly under 36 burning floodlights.
So many were calling the first 2 fights between Tony Zale and Rocky Graziano the greatest slugfest of all time. Rocky had even the score, and boxing fans were already eagerly anticipating the rubber match. Graziano's win over Zale put the New York State Athletic Commission in a precarious position of having a man now recognised as the undisputed middleweight champion of the world who was under suspension in his home state. Regardless of his suspension, Rocky returned to Brooklyn, New York. Not like in the first fight when he came back as a sellout, he was now a hero. He rode home from Grand Central Station in an open-top car to signs of welcome and congratulations on the shore fronts of his neighbourhood. However, when Rocky returned to his home in Brooklyn, had been burgled while he was in New York in the ring fighting. They actually stole Rocky's suits, sports jackets and sweaters, cufflinks and jewelry, you name it, they robbed the gaff. His celebrations were actually cut short when word came out of Chicago that Rocky Graziano had been banned for competing again in the state of Illinois. Already under suspension in New York, Rocky learned that he could no longer fight in Illinois either, because the state's athletic commission issued a ruling barring dishonorably discharged servicemen from boxing in the state. They expressed their regret that the War Department hadn't shared Rocky's service record prior to the fight the previous July. They indicated that they would not have allowed the fight to go forward if they had known Rocky's service history. While Rocky couldn't be reached for comment, Cohen issued a statement in response that read, "I can only say now that when Rocky entered the army, he was a wild kid from the city streets, a kid who never had the privileges of most youngsters as he grew up. He had learned the hard way that the army wasn't fooling when it gave him a new pattern to live by. The Graziano of today is different from the Rocky who entered the army as day and night."
The NBA, National Boxing Association, then said they would ban Rocky from defending their title if the Army agreed with the Illinois Athletic Commission. With all this now hanging over Rocky, a fight was being mentioned to still take place in Miami, and when Zale was asked about the rubber match, he said, "I really want to meet Graciano again, in the worst way. I know I can lick him this time. I just hope nothing goes wrong to upset the Miami plans. I want the fight more than anything." However, Florida's governor objected to Rocky fighting in the state, so that location was off the radar. At the end, the Ring magazine editor Nat Fleischer named the second Zale Graciano fight as the 1947 Fight of the Year. Zale stopped Al Turner on January the 23rd in 5 rounds, and then 5 days later, boxing promoter Al Wheel, who would later go on to manage heavyweight champion Rocky Marciano in the 1950s, announced that he had offered Rocky Graziano $120,000 to defend his title against Tony Zale at the Atlantic City, New Jersey Convention Hall in May. Zale was offered $60,000 for the rubber match, but he kept himself busy when he recorded another stoppage victory against Bobby Claus in early March. He then knocked out Lew Woods 10 days later in Ohio. By the end of March, New Jersey's Bayonne Times quoted Rocky as saying that he had signed a contract to defend the title against Zale at Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City on June the 9th. Jersey City was selected over Atlantic City because it was closer to the New York fight followers. The Tournament of Champions posted a $10,000 bond for the use of the stadium. In the meantime, Rocky defeated Sonny Horn in a tune-up fight on April the 5th, but appeared rusty in winning a 10-round decision.
And Rocky summed up his feelings on his performance against Horn afterwards. He said, "I needed this one. If they don't ban me out of the ring, they'll rust me out." Many of those in attendance were dissatisfied with his performance as well and booed him when the decision was announced. I mean, he must feel like, what the hell's going on? Why? What? It's like all these fat white dudes have just got a problem with him. I say, I don't quite understand it. Like, maybe because he wasn't religious. Who knows? You know, it was very religious back then. Tony Zale and Rocky Graziano met in New York on April 8th and officially signed for the fight, and signed in the presence of Andy Neidreiter, who had now replaced Al Will for that Tournament of Champions. Al Will had left them. NBA president was there, Abe Greene, and the head of the Tournament Champions, Ben Boudin. Now, Zale said, "I think I'll do better this time, and it won't go as long as it did before." At his own table, Rocky Graziano said, "Sure, they said I looked bad against Horn the other night, but how can you keep your mind on a fight when all this other stuff is bothering you?" And you've got to give him his dues, that is right. By mid-April, Zale deported to Hot Springs, Arkansas, to begin his road work on the Ozark Mountains. Meanwhile, Rocky Graziano, the 12-5 favourite for the fight, went into a camp called Neville County Club, where he reportedly did 14 miles of road work each morning and worked in the gym in the afternoons. Well, Rocky Graziano training that hard, that's incredible. Asked about the focus on improving his left hand now, Rocky, now a year older at 28, said, "I'm getting better with the left. It'll hurt someone, but no use kidding. I'll have to do the business with my right when I get in there with Zale again." On May the 20th, Rocky had returned to New York City and was training back at the Stillman's gym, while Tony Zale, now 35, had shifted his training to Chicago. On his last day of training, an extremely confident Tony Zale, as he's always pretty confident. I feel stronger than I did in Chicago and stronger than I did in the first Graziano fight here in 46. This is one fight I've got to win.
At the weigh-in, Rocky Graziano, now 47-7-5, was first on the scale, and his weight was incorrectly announced by the NBA president Abe Greene as 185.5 pounds. He embarrassingly corrected his mistake and reported the weight at 158.5, while several of the crowd chuckled. Tony Zale, now 66-17-2, then stepped on the scale and weighed in at 158.75 pounds. The fight took place at the Rupert Stadium in Newark, New Jersey on June the 10th, 1948. The fight had been postponed one day because of heavy rain. A crowd of 21,500 showed up at the stadium to witness the third and final act of the Zale Graziano Wars. The ticket sale revenues was over $300,000, combined with the broadcast and motion picture rights of $70,000, generated a total gross gate of over $400,000. However, television was banned by the promoters. The referee for the rubber match was Paul Cavalier, and he gave his instructions to both fighters before the bell. So now we go into the third and final act of the tale of Graziano and Zale. Round number 1, and the fighters boxed cautiously in the opening seconds, circling each other while looking for an opening. Midway through the round, Zale made the first move, and he leapt in and caught Rocky with a left hook to the jaw as he was backing away, and the champion, making his first defence, hit the deck, but quickly bounced back to his feet before the referee could even begin a count. When they resumed the action, Rocky threw a left hook followed by a weak right hand and received a hard right to the body in return. Zale looked sharp and punished him to the body as Rocky tried to establish his new established left hand throughout the round, but was driven to the ropes where he was hit with a vicious combination as the bell sounded.
Rocky said later that when he returned to his corner after that first round, his trainer Whitey Brimstein encouraged him to keep throwing those left hooks, and that they had Zale off balance because he wasn't expecting them. Some people say that that was a wrong choice. We won't really ever know. It's difficult. So into round 2, and both fighters began circling one another. Rocky Graziano was working behind his jab. Well, never had a jab. And then tried to land a left hook to the head, but Zale evaded the shot. Zale looked sharper while Rocky's timing was just well off. He was hurt to the body while trying to throw wild punches, but as the round neared its end, Rocky became more aggressive and he began to land hard rights to the head. While Rocky was going hell for leather, most of his punches were landed on the arms and missing altogether, but Zale backed away anyway. It was now 1 round each as the bell sounded for the opening of the third session. Zale quickly took the centre of the ring then. As Rocky leaned forward, he was caught with a sweeping left hook that landed flush on Rocky's jaw and sent him stumbling backwards into the ropes. Zale sensed an opportunity, sensed an opening, and quickly tried to land a right to the body, followed by another left to the jaw. He loves that, doesn't he? The punches didn't land solidly, but another left to the jaw did. As Rocky tried to evade further punishment, he was forced to grab the middle rope to keep himself from going down. As he regained his footing, Zale was all over him like a rash, landing with both hands to the body and the head. Rocky now, by this point, he looked dazed, his legs wobbled as Zale backed off to just give himself that little bit of room, as we see, that little bit of room. Rocky advanced and missed with a wild overhand right that left him exposed. Zale exploited the situation, and with that wonderful trademark right to the body followed by the left hook to the head, Rocky dropped onto his stomach.
While on the floor, Rocky grabbed the lower rope with his left hand, struggled to his knees, and then shakily got back to his feet at the count of 7. He tried to steady himself by holding onto the top rope while he fell backward, the rope holding him up. Cavalier stepped forward and grabbed both forearms. One reporter later suggested that might have helped Rocky stay on his feet at the time. But after a quick shake of Rocky's arms and a look into his eyes, Cavalier backed away and allowed the action to continue. Zale delivered a series of blows to the body while Rocky was pinned against the ropes. Rocky got away and stumbled backwards towards the centre of the ring with Zale hot on his trail. Rocky threw a left jab, but Zale expertly slipped it with a deft tilt of his head and delivered another right to the body, followed by a booming left hook that landed on the point of the chin. Rocky collapsed in slow motion, and his head whacked against the canvas. The referee quickly bent down and removed the guard from Rocky's mouth as he called out a count of 10. Zale calmly headed back to his corner, where his jubilant handlers congratulated him. Tony Zale had become the first man to regain the middleweight title after losing it since Stanley Ketchel did 40 years earlier against Billy Patke. In his autobiography, Rocky said of the left hook that knocked him out, "What I didn't realise was that left hook in the third round, the last of Rocco Barbella, had been knocked out of me. The wild kid was gone forever, the street fighter, the animal, and troublemaker."
Great words from Rocky. And Tony Zale told the reporters that he wanted to keep on fighting. He said another couple of years anyway. But he did make it clear that he was through, absolutely through with fighting Rocky Graziano, saying that I'll not fight Rocky again. I gave him 3 cracks at my chin. What more could he ask? Many years later, when Rocky reflected on their trilogy, he said this of Tony: "Tough guy, Tony Zale. He was a tough fighting Polish boy. No, the truth is he was the toughest man I ever fought. He was quiet outside the ring, but not quiet in it." And that brought an end to one of the greatest boxing rivalries in the history of the sport, quite simply. There's not really much more to go on, but we're going to round off their careers. So this is Rocky Graziano's career after the Zale trilogy, and it took a year for Rocky to return to the ring after Zale. Greene, the NBA president, announced, like I did mention earlier, he was going to looking at suspending him. Well, he indefinitely suspended Rocky in all parts of the world under the NBA supervision. Following similar action was the California State Athletic Commission. The suspension covered all the American states, Great Britain, the European Boxing Federation, Cuba, Mexico, and Canada. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, we'll get into this in a minute, Sean, but I don't get this. It wasn't until May 7, 1949 that the New York Times ran a headline informing boxing fans that Rocky's boxing license had been restored by the New York State Athletic Commission. California followed the example of New York lifting his suspension, as did Greene. It all started with boxing promoter Ralph Tribbiani, who got him a boxing license in Delaware, which then led to the reinstatement by the NBA, the New York State Athletic Commission, and California, which meant that Rocky could return to the ring finally after a year on June 21st. Rocky fought 21 times. Get this, 21 times from June 1949 to March 1952. He won 20. He knocked out 17, and he drew only 1. And it led him to the path of another middleweight shot. Unfortunately, it was against the great Sugar Ray Robinson.
And that would end in disappointment, losing by a brutal third-round knockout. His last professional fight was against Chuck Davey, and he lost by a 10-round decision on September the 17th, 1952 at the Chicago Stadium. Rocky Graziano ended his career with a record of 67 wins, 52 by way of knockout and 10 losses, with 6 draws. We're going to move into Tony Zale's career in the aftermath of the Rocky trilogy, and Zale made one more defence of his title against the excellent French middleweight Marcel Cerdan, who had patiently waited for 3 fights with Graciano to come to an end. There were calls for him to retire after retaining this title rather than fighting Cerdan, as he had nothing left to prove, but he couldn't resist. That fight was named Ring Magazine Fight of the Year for 1948, but it was a bad night at the office for Zale, back at the Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City. Zale was floored with a left hook at the close of the 11th round and was helped back to his corner by his trainer. The referee Cavalier stopped the fight in between the rounds. Zale only won 2 rounds of the 11 and was battered from pillar to post by the French scrapper. Tony Zale then retired from the ring afterwards with a career record of 67 wins, 45 by way of knockout, 18 defeats and 2 draws. In 1973, Rocky Graziano phoned Tony and requested that he come to New York to help promote the grand opening of Willie Pep's new restaurant along with Sandy Sadler. Tony quickly rearranged his schedule of duties with the Chicago Park District boxing program so he could comply with the request, and he and Rocky took the city by storm that spring. They made numerous appearances for charitable fundraisers together and had lots of fun.
Fantastic. I love that. Great to see they remain friends, as a lot of these fighters do. So we're going to end this with just a couple of legends, really. on this fight, on this trilogy. And here are a couple of legends that spoke about the just tremendous trilogy. And one of the greatest trainers ever lived, the late, great Ray Arcel, gave his opinion on the two warriors. He said the two of them were really street fighters, no holds barred. They came right at you, and you had to make sure you didn't give any quarter. And I think there's no one better to finish off this historic legendary night than the legendary and late Burt Sugar. And he wrote this in his book, Burt Sugar's Punchlines, the best of boxing's most colourful writer, about this trilogy. He said there have been twosomes throughout history that have gone together like salt and pepper. Boxing has its own twosomes. Perhaps one of its famous pairings was that of Zale and Graziano. Like it says in the song Love and Marriage, you can't have one without the other. For 3 years, rivals Tony Zale and Rocky Graziano lit up the skies in the world of boxing with fireworks, and today, a half a century later, their fights are still legendary. They weren't fights, they were wars without survivors.
Well, perfect way to end an unbelievable trilogy of fights. And the one thing we will say is that there isn't a great deal of footage out there other than highlights of some of these fights. So if you are scouring the internet looking for them, you will only find certain highlights of the fights. It's probably going to be one individual that holds the rights and the films to these. And I think that's probably going to be Steve Lott, who runs the Boxing Hall of Fame. He owns a lot of rights to a lot of these fights, and he's probably got an absolute library of them stashed away somewhere. And these fights are probably there in its entirety. What is only available is what has been put up on the internet, just highlights of the fights. But from what you can see from the descriptions of the people that were there, that attended these fights ringside, they sound like the modern day trilogies that we've grew up on, the Gatti Wards, the Morales Barrera trilogies. They sound exactly like they could fit in to that genre of fantastic boxing matches. It's just a shame it happened so many years ago, where there is not that much available to be able to see it. But maybe Steve Lott, if anybody knows Steve personally that could get in touch with him, maybe he would be willing to share some of that footage. It would be great to see all these fights in their entirety, but if you do want to see some of the highlights of it, you can go onto YouTube, of course, and find all these fights. But what a hell of a story. What a hell of a story and a hell of a trilogy. And, you know, I felt a lot for Rocky throughout the course of the story, because he talks about these issues with bribes throughout the course of it. And we know how rife the mafia was at this period of time coming into it, and how they ruled boxing for a number of years following these trilogies with, you know, with these fighters. But it was just a shame that he was so open and honest about things, where he could have been quite secretive about what went on. He seemed quite open and honest about it, and it was like he was punished and made an example of, as opposed to being applauded for his honesty. Instead, he was punished, and as a result, you know, he lost a bit of time in his boxing career because of it, and it did affect him in many ways. And it's obvious when he tells it himself in his own words from the quotes that we've given you in this story, that it obviously affected him massively. To be as honest as he was, yet he was being punished for it, it just doesn't seem right. But that's what happened to him. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from me from the story, is, you know, how he overcame so much adversity to end up becoming the middleweight champion of the world. And Tony Zale himself, with his trademark shot, was such a fantastic fighter. Two wonderful fighters from that period of time, which I implore you guys that are listening to go and look them up and look at what they did throughout their careers and other events that they were involved in. Obviously, we've skimmed over some of their parts of the career for the purposes of this episode, and when we do career profiles, maybe when we do some on Graciano and some on Zale, we'll have a lot more information for you guys to look into and hear about from us. But Johnston, I've really enjoyed going through this story and this trilogy, and whilst it might not feel like a stereotypical legendary night, it is ultimately a legendary night. It's a trilogy between two fighters that give us three of the greatest wars that have just been forgotten about.
They have, and it is a bit like that, isn't it? Because of the fact that we can't just grab it off of YouTube. And I do feel like these tapes I've heard about. I think I see something where Joe Lewis said that he had seen them, and he actually said that they should be locked away for a long time and then brought out just 100 years later. Because is they're that. I mean, this is Joe Lewis. They're that good. I mean, everyone that was there, they were fantastic. It is almost like a Hagler Hearns. It is almost like a Gatty Ward, like an Ali Frazier, isn't it, Sean? It really is. I think we've never actually described fights like that. I mean, the one thing we've got to say is to get obviously the information we got on the fights, got to give a huge shout out to the information where we got it from, and just to start with Tony Zale's book, which was written by Fad Zale and Clay Moyles, which was a great. Their descriptions of the fight were fantastic. So a lot of that come from that. There's also, if you want to listen to it, you got the Tony Zale and the Rocky Graziano Prime Time Boxing. You can listen to that free. You can sign up, listen to it on the audio. It's narrated by Don Dumfries, Bill Coram, Bill Caton, and Bob Page. There are ridiculous adverts in between some of them, which is sort of publicising. But if you can get past that, you can listen to the real footage, the actual audio footage of that fight. So I would recommend you that. And also the book as well. Another book, which was Rocky Graziano's book, not his book written by him, but by Jeffrey Sussman. Now, all that information was where we managed to get the description of these fights. And we don't normally do this, Sean, do we? We don't describe fights like this because you have the advantage of just going on YouTube and looking at it. So what we do is try to bring the ins and outs of it. So it's a bit different, this one, but I hope by us doing that, you got a gist of what it was like, and hopefully that will want to make you go and read these books, listen to the audio. The literature is out there. We've got the great historians like Bert Sugar. You can watch that on YouTube, where there's like a legendary. I think they talk mainly about the third fight because that's where the main footage is, but he does a bit like what we've done, but not as much detail. So that's Bert Sugar talking about it. But look, this is a great trilogy, Sean. It really is. And I'm glad we've been able to do it. It's something we've always wanted to do. It's getting the time to do it. And we felt that the season 3 was the perfect time to do it. I hope you enjoyed it. And it was great fun to do. And I can see a career profile, Rocky Graziano, Sean, 100%. What a great guy.
Absolutely, both characters in their own right, and definitely future career profiles, 100%. Well, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do let us know on social media, on Twitter at Legend Night Pod or at BTR Boxing Pod. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram. If you're watching / listening on YouTube, please leave a comment in the below comments box about what you think about the episode. Make sure you've already subscribed to us. If you haven't done so, please go and do it. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, any available podcasting app out there. You can subscribe to us. If you are on Apple, please make sure you've left us a rating and a review. It really does help us. A final shout out to the patrons of the BTR Boxing Podcast Network for all your wonderful support. You've become a member of the Patreon membership service. You've had early access to this episode and many others, ad-free episodes, patron-only content. You even get to select episodes, and we do little mini episodes for you guys as well. And if you're listening and you're not a patron yet and it does sound appealing to you, then please go and check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. You can support us on there. That little bit of support does go a long way for us, and it does allow us to get the literature and the research that we need to produce these episodes and give you as much information as possible when listening to these stories. That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the tale of Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale.